Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Cynics. I am Kevin Twain Lowry, Dr. K, and here with me is my co-host, Isaac Dillman, the all-seeing eye dog.
Howdy, howdy.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart because I have a science background. Isaac knows this. I don't know how many of our listeners would know this or would really even care, I guess. But I do. I worked as a couple of years as an engineer. I have undergrad degrees in physics and mathematics. But, of course, I later went into ministry and then went on to get a PhD in theology from Notre Dame. Well, the integration, like the relationship between religion and science was my minor at Notre Dame. The thing that kind of has been kind of a personal thing for me is how a lot of religious people take their religion to a point of actually not allowing our knowledge of science to really inform their worldview.
Yeah, it's like science has like a back seat.
Right, right.
Science is, when it's, comfortable, we acknowledge science, but...
Well, and the obvious one, of course, like for Christians was evolution. But even beyond evolution, it's just that, okay, so I'm not saying I'm a tremendous fan of the 18th century deists, but there was a reason why deism was a thing at the founding of this country. And it's because a number of the founders, and, this was right in the middle of the Enlightenment, and they allowed the scientific knowledge that we were gaining to influence the way they interpreted the world, their worldview. And they did not allow religious tradition or myth to override that. And
yeah,
I think, and we can maybe make this our landing spot at the end of these two episodes and maybe come back to, like, at what point is this really important, or am I just getting upset? Would I object to people that don't want to walk under a ladder, or
right,
or let a black cat cross in front of them, or have to throw salt over their shoulder if they spill it, or something like that. It just kind of reminds me of the, you've watched the old Andy Griffith series, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you remember the Darling family?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they bought into all this mountain folklore.
Yeah, they live up in the middle of the mountains.
Right. There was a certain amount of that on my mom's side of the family. My grandmother had actually bought into some of that superstitious stuff, because they were I wouldn't say backwoods, but they were rural Pennsylvania Dutch people. And, like my grandmother insisted that my parents get married while the moon was waxing and not waning. So I know, I mean, we laughed about that years later, but, at the time that was like a big deal, and she made like a big deal about it. So, I remember as a little kid, before we started going to the Wesleyan church, and this really wasn't something that was practiced at the Methodist church that I was raised in as a young child, but I think just came from my grandmother's side of the family. Did I tell you about this with the Bible verses before?
No, I don't think so. Okay,
so from the time I can remember up until probably when I was about 7, 8 years old, they had this practice where they would take a piece of cloth and write the reference to a Bible verse on it. I can't remember what he shall give his angels charge over thee, or I can't remember what it was, or
Sure.
that the demons, even the demons have to submit to the name of Jesus or something. I can't remember what it was, what the exact verse was, but they would write this reference on there, and then they would sew a cloth pouch to put this Bible reference in. And they had, like my mom had several of these pouches, and there was always one pinned to the tag of my T-shirt under all my shirts, so that
very interesting.
So so all the time there was one of these pouches with a Bible verse reference on it,
like a spell.
Yes, it was supposed to protect me from evil spirits.
Yeah,
and and that came from my grandmother's side of the family. But that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And the thing is that a lot of the mystical people, and this isn't just limited to Christianity, because there are mystics in all religions, but of course, here in the United States, Christian mysticism is what everybody's most familiar with. And so I guess the question is, at the end of the day, how much should our scientific knowledge of the world impact the way we view the world and like religion? People basically take religion to give them their worldview, and then they filter science and other learning through that, and then discard whatever doesn't fit their religious worldview, which to me is just a way of it's really a bad mistake of ignoring a lot of human learning.
Yeah, well, and I think it comes with costs that aren't immediately apparent to that like religious worldview.
Right.
And I think one of those costs is actually that people who have been raised that way, I mean, myself included, I had to learn this, but they don't even know that they don't have a scientific worldview because they don't know what that means.
Well, absolutely, because I have colleague friends that I believe that need to hear this kind of an episode. I would challenge them, not as a means of trying to destroy their faith. And let me be clear. What really kind of gets me is, or let me say this. What I think is important is what people regard as the rule and what is the exception. And there's nothing wrong with somebody hoping to be healed of something, or hoping for a miracle to take place. But whenever people start expecting that things are just going to kind of magically happen because they pray about them, I would say, that was acceptable before we had modern science and technology, but the technology we have today and the science we have today, I think we're kind of past the point where that becomes acceptable. It's no more acceptable than, say, somebody who's 21 years old still believing in Santa Claus. I mean, what's wrong with just understanding that mom and dad go out and buy the presents and wrap them and slide them under the tree? So let's kick this off. And we'll circle back around to this discussion that we just started, unless I don't want to cut you off here, but
no, I think this is a good jumping off point for what does a scientific worldview mean?
All right.
What are the basic tenets of that idea?
Yeah. So let me go back to just talking about how ancient people viewed the world, and even up through the medieval period. Okay. Before we had modern science, and what I'm calling modern science, we refer to as the scientific revolution. There were really two inventions that enabled what we call modern science, and really got it off the ground. And there was a shift in thinking. The shift in thinking was embracing empiricism, that all knowledge comes through sense experience. That was embraced in the late medieval period by the scholastic thinkers, like the 12th through the 15th centuries. Okay. But in terms of the inventions, the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg was important because that made it easier for people to learn, write their stuff down, print it, and then distribute it to others, so that there could be more systematic study that went on. And then the perfection of the perfection or development of the lens was really important, because in studying optics and developing a lens, we started able to see things that were very distant in space that you can't see with the naked eye. And we started, say, like in biology and physics, to be able to see things that are very small that you can't see with the naked eye.
Yeah. Well, and in terms of like philosophy that's happening at the same time, isn't this sort of co-occurring with the rediscovery of Aristotle?
Yes.
And like the interaction with Islamic thinkers who give us stuff like algebra.
Well, exactly. At the end of the first millennium, the Muslim scholars, what they called there was the House of Baghdad, where there were several scholars that were trying to translate. So the Muslims, with the spread of Islam, there were some of the early caliphs like Umar and such that were, or Uthman, that were rumored to have destroyed a lot of the writings, like the library in Alexandria, for example. And there were those that accused them of doing that. But the Muslims also had scholars that benefited from whatever acquired knowledge they got from the cultures that they conquered. And they started making some use of this. And there was what was called the Golden Age of Islam. I mean, a lot of people don't stop and think that in the West, we use Arabic numbers.
Right. Yeah.
And there's a reason we use Arabic numbers, is because...
Yeah, we're not doing Roman numerals.
No, we gave that up because the Muslim scholars, by the end of the first millennium, had developed algebra, which is an Arabic term, just like algorithm is another Arabic term. And they had systematized a number of things. Now you got your skeptics out there, like I play in World Religions. Sam Harris goes off and basically says, they were doing nothing but using optics to try to find how to face Mecca whenever you pray. Well, I think it was more than that. And I think there's enough scholarship to say that. Now, maybe it wasn't as grand and glorious or as far reaching, but I do think there was honest scholarship there. And the Muslim thinkers had advanced things in a certain way. And if you read even like their philosophers, like Averroes, Avicenna, they are even starting to advocate not interpreting the Quran literally and things like that. But then there was like Al-Ghazali led like a conservative backlash against that kind of teaching. And there was a conservative backlash that kind of squelched that kind of teaching. You had the Ottoman Empire that started to become a little more secular, but when it fell apart at the end of World War I, because they sided with the Axis powers in World War I, well, when that whole caliphate dropped out, well, then Islam started becoming more splintered, and then you started having these conservative backlash movements throughout the Middle East. And this is how by the 70s we ended up with, like ISIS and there was other things going on, like the United States sticking its nose in, trying to affect the outcomes of the way the governments were going to go and things like that. But the thing is that it was the writings of Aristotle over and against Platonism. Platonism was used to basically justify that there are these higher absolute truths. And the religious authorities said, yeah, we have the absolute truths, like the Quran is inerrant, or the Christians, the church or the Pope is inerrant. Then the Protestant reformers, the Bible's inerrant. So you had these kind of like, there's these higher truth. And then what we learn in the empirical realm through our senses, that's just all shadows, like on the wall of the cave. And you can't trust that. Well, Aristotle. Well, and go so ahead. Like, I'm sorry.
For to put it in like normal people terms, Platonism is basically just like deductive reasoning taken to the extreme. And deductive reasoning is when you start with an assumption and you deduct conclusions from those assumptions.
Well, yeah, everything rises and falls on knowing what the absolutes are. So Platonism is about that they're absolutes. So, for example, like Plato would say, okay, well, how do we judge what a good chair is? Well, there's the idea of the perfect chair out there in the metaphysical realm. And so to the extent that each chair approximates that a degree of chairness, then that it is a good chair, like to that extent. Well, Aristotle said, okay, there are absolutes, but we can't know what they are, at least in this world, because Aristotle said, he basically is rejecting that there's this like direct intuitive knowledge.
And Aristotle represents a total inversion of the Platonic system.
Well, absolutely. And so the Platonic system actually came back in the first century because, Plato was about 4 centuries before Christ. Aristotle was right after him because he was Plato's pupil.
Yeah.
But like by the time of the writing of the New Testament, you can see the Neoplatonism in some of the Apostle Paul's writings. So he's basically pitting like the mind against the body. And so there's this kind of like spiritual battle that's going on between the soul and the body. And it's kind of quasi-Gnostic type themes. And the Gnostics basically believe that you just kind of directly intuit. You have this mystical knowledge that you get directly. Well, Christians rejected that, but yet they still said, well, the truth, though, gets handed down through the bishops and the apostolic succession. And so it was. But
compared to Plato, what Aristotle is doing is saying, well, you don't start with your assumptions and then get down to the specific applications of them. You start with your specific observations, right? And that's like a key thing. You start with your experiences and then you build a network of categories out of those experiences. That is like one of the key like fundamentals of how science works.
Yes. Basically, Platonism basically discounts what we learn through our senses because what you intuit directly is the absolute. And then you only trust your senses to the extent that it lines up with that. And so that was used by the religious authorities, both in Christianity and Islam, to basically suppress the opinions of thinkers. Aristotelianism, Aristotle's thought, says we can't know what the absolutes are. Everybody's fallible. Everybody's approaching knowledge from a relative standpoint based on our experiences. So the way to get closer to the absolutes is for all of us to share he doesn't quite come out and say this, but this is the way this is the implication of it. The more experience we can integrate together, the closer we get to the ideals. And so knowledge is built from the ground up. Well, then that changes the ball game because in the West, under Platonism, it doesn't make sense to teach people to read and write because you're just going to have more people with wrong ideas thinking that they know something. Where Aristotelianism says, no, we can actually learn from one another's experiences. So the more people we have observing, let's teach them to read and write, and we can share ideas and pool knowledge. And the Christians started founding universities. This was in this time period. It was in the 11th century that you had University of Bologna and Oxford. Yeah.
Yeah, this is like following the fall of Rome. For those playing along at home with like following with history, Aristotle gets like sort of recast into scholasticism. So if you hear, this is something that like when I was studying philosophy, this was helpful for me is to be like, oh, if you hear scholasticism, that's like Aristotelianism too.
Yeah, right.
This is the sequel to Aristotle is the scholastics.
Right.
And the scholastics come out of this like medieval period that's not Roman Christianity anymore. Right. And during this time, that's when like this like academic rebirth happens out of the Dark Ages.
Right. And there was a lot of political upheaval because that was another thing that kept this from going because you had you had the resurgence of Platonism in the first couple centuries, like the first, second, third centuries.
Right.
But then after the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, everything started focusing on spread, like government, like the merging of church and state and spreading the church. And there wasn't really like an impetus to really change or challenge ideas. And then
right. Well, until the fall of Rome.
Well, yeah, basically when you had the barbarian invasions from the north, and then the West kind of got splintered up, and then there was power struggles, and then the Pope was trying to negotiate the Holy Roman Empire, rebuild the Roman Empire through the Holy Roman Empire,
right,
and all that sort of thing. And then in the meantime, Islam started spreading, and then the Christians were fighting to regain some of those cities. And so it really wasn't until around the end of the first millennium that things started to settle down and people had more time to just study and think and learn again. And so I'm just trying to be a little more diplomatic about the Middle Ages. It wasn't that people didn't care about truth or learning or whatever. It's just that there was so much transition and upheaval, like politically, like geopolitically.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting that like the last important Platonic thinker or Neoplatonic thinker is Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the City of God is about the fall of Rome.
Right. Right.
And then, the next big academic like revival is under Charlemagne, who starts all these universities in Europe.
Right.
And they're all scholastic universities.
Right.
Right. So it's interesting that like the fall of Rome also kind of coincides with the fall of Platonism until you get to the Reformation.
Yeah. I think, Charlemagne had these learning centers. I'm not sure to what extent they may have just been like glorified seminaries or whatever.
They were run through the church, but like to have any schools at that time period was progress.
They generally credit the University of Bologna as the first of the European universities, and it was last half of the 1000s. Okay, so the last part of the 11th century. So I can't remember exact year, but it was around that time. You then had also Oxford and Cambridge and Paris, Padua, Italy. But nevertheless, it made sense then to start studying the world. And so we did. And that's really what happened. And then eventually what ends up spurring science is the development of new technology that enables us to make observations that we could not make before. Okay. And that's just the whole thing. That's the point of the particle collider. Okay.
Right.
In Bern. And we're trying, you're able to make observations that you couldn't have made before.
Well, and those observations allow you to ask fundamental questions about the universe that you could not have even known to ask.
Well, absolutely.
Right. So you get characters like Galileo asking, well, does the sun orbit Earth? Right. That wasn't even something people were asking until you were able to observe it more directly.
Right. Yeah. So, and usually these things kind of come incrementally. So you had Tycho Brahe and Copernicus. Yes, Ptolemy was another one. But Galileo was the guy who, got roasted for it. Now, the Catholic Church never did officially condemn him. They just condemned him of strong suspicion of heresy and then placed him under house arrest. But they never
enforced him not to publish any of his work.
Right. Yeah. And they finally recanted. John Paul II apologized to Galileo in 1992. So
always timely, the Catholics.
It's just like Joan of Arc. She was put to death, and 25 years later they reversed the trial, and then several hundred years later they made her a saint. So anyway, that's the way it goes sometimes. So let's jump in. In what ways did people view the world before we started having science and systematic study of the world. A lot of people viewed the world, and some of this is what gave rise to, say, the positivism of Auguste Comte in the 19th century. And I don't want to just get into all that, but Comte basically said the old world, things were explained according to religious myth. And then at the time of Newton and Galileo, we started having some science, but there were still a lot of things that were still mysterious, like gravity. We know that what it is and how it, like we know how it works, but we don't know why. Like, well, we know the effects of it, but we don't know exactly why bodies attract each other. Like we didn't have the physics to explain that. That's what Einstein was going after, trying to use his notion of warp and curved space and stuff to try to explain gravity. But I've never really found that explanation really all that satisfactory, because it doesn't matter where things are positioned, they're still going to attract. Anyway, I don't know. He wants to say that space is kind of a thing. It's like putting two bowling balls on a bed, that they're eventually going to roll towards each other as the bed
his
gives
theories
in.
of gravity, so that gravity basically doesn't exist, that it's just the curvature of space-time.
Yeah.
That viewed on the scale that we can experience it seems like a force attracting bodies together. But actually, I mean, this is such a tangent, but I think that Einstein is right. The troubling thing is like the gravitational waves that we've been able to observe now.
Yes.
That like we literally see that like changes in density in space do propagate through space-time like waves.
Yes.
Which kind of proves Einstein's theory about the curvature of space-time.
Yes.
But it also troubles it in a way that I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough about this to articulate.
Yeah.
That it does raise questions about that theory.
Well, yes, I think it's more, it's kind of like the way food goes down the esophagus. So like there's this the object in space is kind of being squeezed, and then that's what tends to push objects toward each other.
Yeah.
Well, anyway.
Well, but it's also what really like blows my mind is that like it's also that space and time are really the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Yeah, that movement through space is movement through time. And if you were to not move through space, which is not possible because it's all based on reference points, but
now it sound like Zeno and Zeno's paradoxes of motion.
Well,
anyway.
So, I mean, if we really want to get into like the science nitty gritty, which maybe this would be a better like other episode, but if we want to talk about how calculus is only ever an approximation of truth.
Oh, yeah.
And like how we don't really know what pi is equal to. And that gets into Zeno's paradox and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. I can already tell that this is going to take more than 2 episodes. But we
can abandon those rabbit holes, but
yeah. So, all right, I will explain here. So before we had modern science, a lot of people viewed the world through as a magical place. Like, if you go way back, a lot of these explanations, like, let's just say very ancient people, the volcano erupts. Well, there must be some sort of god or spirit that's causing this, like the rain or the sun. And so ancient people worshiped the sun. They worshiped, like ancient Egyptians worshiped the Nile River. Anything that was going to affect their lives in some way, they believed that everything was guided by these mysterious forces because they didn't.
Yeah, it tended to be animism, which is just like worship.
Right. That's your earliest ancient, like indigenous type religion. So there's all kinds of magical and supernatural forces at work. Well, then over time, as this became expressed through more, let's say, systematic religion, not just people being superstitious about, what made the volcano erupt? What caused that big storm, that hurricane to come through or whatever? Right. You started having people having explanations through myths and such and attributing these events to some sort of spirits or powers or gods that are controlling this. Well, then people started praying. And some of this behavior, it's interesting, because they even get into like cataloging, like and observing and cataloging primates and other more advanced like mammals.
Yeah, like
elephants and such.
And
yeah, bonobos. Chimpanzees, apes. And so there's a certain amount of like a lot of this centered on mortality, the things that would risk killing somebody and or things that were important for the propagation and continued survival, like having children and being able to raise crops, and whenever they started to be able to cultivate plants to eat and things like that. So,
I find it fascinating that like the other gods that you see in ancient cultures are the rulers of empires, right? The people who are erecting like pyramids and huge temples that seem like, well, this is sort of a force of nature, that human civilization is its own force of nature. And whoever's at the top of that must also be a god.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's this sense that if the gods control things, well, they must also control humans. So when they started to form governments, then they assumed that whoever was the head of the government would be manipulated by the gods to do the bidding of the gods. You even see some of this in the even in the Hebrew scriptures. So like the law of the Medes and the Persians, like in the story of Daniel, Darius, he passes that law that you can't pray to any other god. And then Daniel, of course, continues to pray 3 times a day. So he can't reverse it because the belief was that whoever the leader is basically anytime a law is enacted, it's only enacted because the gods want it to be enacted.
Right.
And so you can't reverse a law. And so that kind of went along with it. Yes. There were people though, and this is where building idols and idol worship came into play. There were people who believed, and exists in different cultures, say like even in say Shinto in ancient Japan, and even some of this lingers to today. People believed that if you could make a representation of a god and then dedicate this idol to the god, you could basically entice the god to come and inhabit that idol. And once the god would inhabit that idol, then you had the god as like a captive audience where you could get basically ask things of this god and the god would grant you your wishes. And so this is where the practice of idols came into play, because this was a way, but they would sacrifice, they would make sacrifices. So they would kill animals. They would sometimes kill people, like the ancient Aztecs, Olmecs, Toltecs. They were sometimes killing people each day. Like the Aztecs did live heart extractions. Yeah. They have paintings depicting this. And this is what some of the conquistadors said that they saw. When they come over.
Well, and that was a global practice too, human sacrifice.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, this is one of the things like in Judaism. So like the story with God commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and then stopping him was like saying, okay, I know you're willing to do it, but you won't have to do that. I'll let you kill an animal instead. But yet, whenever the Israelites were trying to get out of Egypt, the story is that the last of the plagues was God sent the death angel in to kill the firstborn of every family. So that's where the Passover and all that, the Seder meal and all that come into play. But you have all these people, like, in other words, you're making some sort of exchange with the gods in order to gain the gods' favor. Okay. They would perform these other rituals and things, and it was all about appeasing the gods. There was some sort of exchange. We give something to the gods give us something in return. In places where people didn't have much drinking water, they would actually take some of their drinking water and pour it out to the gods. And there were other places where they would like inhale hallucinogenic drugs. Well, or like burn incense. Like if they like the smell, it's like Yankee Candle. So you light something nice, and the belief is the ancient people, if we enjoy it, then the gods must enjoy it too. So
Right.
the people would lay food on the altar, or they would burn something that smelled good, and so this is how these kind of like. Ancient people believed that these magical forces or supernatural forces could be manipulated or influenced through prayers, offerings, these other kinds of rituals. And then they developed myths to explain these forces. So here's the gods, and here's how we came about, and here's our relationship with the gods, and yada, yada, yada. So all the religions have these like early myths about how we got started and what being created us, or where do we come from. And I mean, because there's all different kinds of, now this is where a lot of Christian people don't want to acknowledge that the two creation myths you have in the book of Genesis were actually adaptations of older Mesopotamian cosmogonies.
Yeah, well, and in some ways they're like commentaries on those.
Right, they are, because they're just basically, changing it to reflect their theology and their view of God. So you had myths, and then you also still had superstitions that weren't a part of formal religion, but a lot of people were still superstitious. And a lot of this just came from somebody observing a strange coincidence and then being afraid to repeat that action because something bad happened the last time it happened. So somebody walks under a ladder, and then the person on the ladder drops a hammer on top of their head or something, and then then that becomes like a bad sign. Or let's say somebody walks under a ladder at the same time their kid falls out of a tree or something, and so then it's these must be related. And so my like background in Girardian stuff kind of comes into play here because. What you find in a lot of cultures, so Girard ties a lot of like mythogenesis, like the creation of myths and the creation of like ritual symbology with this like mimetic crisis where people want the same things, and so they end up in like this like jealous or envious sort of violence. Right. And what you see across many cultures is that a lot of the things that are taboo, that are like, don't walk under a ladder, are things that are mimetic in nature. Mm-hmm. So twins are like oftentimes seen as an evil omen because it's two copies of the same thing. Yes. Which is a reflection of the mimetic crisis because you have two people that are imitating each other. Yes. Yes. It's not like that's tangential to what we're talking about today, but I think it's interesting. No, but there's that part of it, but there's also where this superstition is what caused a lot of people for a long, and we still have difficulty trusting people that are different than us because it's unfamiliar. And so any person that was different than most people was held under suspicion. So somebody that has some kind of a medical condition, it must be, somebody have seizures. It must be something demonic or supernatural. Somebody who's left-handed, they're doing things backwards. They must be influenced by an evil spirit. So anyway, we've talked about some of this before, but this is all part of the same ancient worldview. Okay. And it's like, part of the problem with this, and this is why it's a pre-scientific worldview, because people cannot distinguish real causality from coincidence. And they just think that anything that's different, like in other words, they base everything on what they've known and what they've experienced, and anything that goes outside of that range, then they're automatically distrustful of it. Right. And that's a pre-scientific view, in my opinion, because part of a scientific view is that we've actually learned from the observations of other people. And so, this is why we go to doctors, and we don't just, run out in the woods and pick our own berries or whatever and try to treat everything ourselves with home remedies. But we are actually trusting that somebody else knows what they're doing, and they've gotten information from somebody, and that this medicine the doctor's prescribing for you is going to help you,
Right.
So anyway, now this is where religion basically became like the systematization of these beliefs and centered around these myths and superstitions. So religion becomes this kind of, and you see this in the earliest religions. So like in the Rig Veda, which in the founding of Hinduism, and then you later have Jainism as a spinoff, and then you have Buddhism as a spinoff. Okay. But it's all like the earliest text are these like ritualistic texts on how you should, what kind of offerings you need to give and how you should do the offering and things like that. And then later you get these stories about, oh, well, there's this God and that God, and this God is an avatar of this one. And then it starts to develop into this is how people should live. And then it starts getting more and more practical and philosophical as it goes. And then you end up having like entire systematic expressions of this religion and like a theology that comes out of it. And this is kind of the way things start. So, even if you want to look at it in terms of Christianity, it's the same thing. So everything starts with Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings, and then the accounts of his death and his resurrection. And so everything starts with that. And then you have people reflecting on, okay, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? Was he just a victim of politics? No, he was dying for the sins of the world. So it's given context through the Hebrew scriptures, okay? And so it just kind of, then you end up, by the time of Augustine, you have like the first full-fledged, like comprehensive statement of Christian theology or Christian thought. But it takes centuries, like, for this stuff to develop just from particular stories and dialogues and, excurses and things like that to getting it up to where it becomes more and more systematized into stories and into principles, and then finally into some kind of a systematic thought where then it gets to a point where okay, so based on this systematic thought, when a new issue comes up, this is how people in our religion should think about it. And somebody disagrees, well, that's not according to our system of thought. And
right.
So you end up, sometimes these groups end up splitting. So just like Islam, it all starts with just this infallible Quran, but doesn't take long for there to be partisans, Shiites, who, because of the caliphates, and they only want to recognize Ali as the successor to Muhammad.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then they end up splintering, and the more systematic it gets, the more splintered it becomes. And Catholicism has its different orders. And a lot of Protestants aren't aware of this. So you have like your Augustinians and your Franciscans and your Jesuits and your Dominicans, the Order of Paul, the Order of the Holy Cross, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got the sisters of this, the brothers of that, and you got all these different orders. Well, then the same thing with Protestants, how many different denominations. And now you've got individual, independent churches that can be as idiosyncratic as they want to be.
Right.
This is just kind of the way it all develops. But this is what, let's put it this way. And I want to be careful how I want to say this. But here's the thing. A lot of people think because the world's religions that have survived and have become systematized in their thought with different schools of thought and all that, they don't want to recognize that it still all comes back to one particular account or certain mythology or something that happened. Like with Islam, everything rides on Muhammad and his prophecies. Okay, the message he got from God.
Right.
And so it all rises and falls on that. Now, in Judaism, Christianity, well, see, these Christians want to collapse like all of scriptures as though like they were all dictated by God to different people. That's not really the way the text, so whenever they don't even want to face even the own reality of even understanding their own text and where they came from, because they want to even have, let's put it this way, a pre-scientific view of their own religion. And so this becomes a part of the later science, is that we start understanding like the development of religious thought makes it seem so grandiose, and it must be true because of how wonderful it is. Like you go to a cathedral and listen
the
to
system works so perfectly.
Right. So you hear this great sermon in the cathedral, and the pipe organ and the voices singing, and you look at the artwork and it's all so awe-inspiring. Oh, it must all be true. Well, but when you start to think about it, it all kind of boils down to, okay, there's a handful of people in ancient Palestine who claimed a guy rose from the dead. And that's really where it all started. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying anybody should
just like with Islam, it all rises and falls on that point.
Right. Exactly. And I'm not saying that to discount either faith. But what I'm saying is a lot of people don't stop to think about the difference between like what is at the core of a religion and versus how has it been developed over time by a bunch of different hands. But yet they still want to view the final product as though it were handed down like that final product, which it wasn't. See? And so it's just like Mormons today. They've got all kinds of apologetics to explain why Joseph Smith and Brigham Young weren't polygamist, or why they were for a while, or whatever
and
theory.
Then God changed his mind, and yeah.
Right. And so rather than, realizing he just had people going on like just a thread of something that Smith could convince them made them look legitimate. And that's really what it's all based on. And, anyway, it's like the golden plates. Okay. So again, it's like these golden plates that he supposedly translated. Well, if that whole thing turns out to be a hoax, it doesn't matter how wonderful it is or how many Osmond families Mormonism produces or whatever. It still hinges on what a guy claiming, an angel showed him golden plates.
That only matters if you care about whether or not it's true, right?
Well, yes. That is.
If it's just like, if your buy-in is, well, look at how many like beautiful families are Mormon, and Mormonism produces all these, empowered young people to be happy and healthy, then and you're not concerned with, is it true though? Then I think, we're out of the conversational like parameters. Well, there is at the center of this discussion, there is like an inherent allegiance to the truth that has to undermine everything. Like everything has to be foundational on this. Like it doesn't matter whether this is true or not.
Yeah. And here's the thing. There are reasons for embracing the different faiths that people have. There's reasons that the religions that are still around, they are still around because people have found them to be helpful and relevant. But they've stayed helpful and relevant by changing over time. And all I'm suggesting is that people will be willing to see their own religions through an actual historical understanding of how they came to be what they are. But yet, people want
part of this.
Go ahead.
Part of this is that like the pre-scientific worldview that is pretty much like in this day and age, it's the religious worldview. Although some people who adopt the pre-scientific worldview wouldn't identify as religious. I'm spiritual, not religious, whatever. Mm-hmm. But like it does have ethical implications that are harmful. So like a good example is like we talked about the Rig Veda.
Right.
And there's this sort of revival of like, Vedic medicine as an alternative to Western medicine.
Yeah.
And Western medicine sort of gets billed as like, oh, it's the pharmacy companies. It's all these, the insurance companies that like really just want to like suck you dry for all you're worth. Where the difference is like Western medicine is based on, it's evidence-based medicine.
Right.
Whereas like Vedic medicine or Chinese medicine is not evidence-based. It's religious medicine.
Right.
That is like a really easy example to point like this is why having a scientific worldview is important.
Well, that's like saying because Mercedeses are overpriced, then they're not a good car.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Our drugs are overpriced because the companies do want to make money on them, but that doesn't invalidate whether the medicine's good or not.
Yeah, well, and it's a mix-up of a critique of like capital-based medicine and science. So like, I'm tangentially familiar with people who perform like Reiki as like a legitimate medical practice. I don't know if you know what Reiki is, but it's where you just like hover your hands over someone's body and you direct energy around.
Oh my golly.
And these things are like common practices that like people, because they don't have any scientific education.
Yeah.
In like, when I say scientific education, I don't mean like, oh, we learned that the earth goes around the sun instead of the other way around. I mean like actual scientific education where you learn how science works and how evidence works.
Right.
You get people who fall for scams.
Right. So, and I'm going to have to wrap this one up because we're really at the end of an episode here, time-wise.
Yeah, I suppose.
So let me just wrap up this because then we'll just basically, I think we can just call this, like what is a pre-scientific worldview? Because we kind of batted around that. But that's the thing. It's like people like this pre-scientific worldview is reflected in all these religious texts. And then people use the text as an excuse to view the text as in a pre-scientific way, like as though the text magically like appeared or were inspired or whatever. And even though careful analysis shows like where these texts came from and who wrote them and why they wrote them, or at least it sheds light on that. So it's not so simple as, oh, well, you had, so-and-so got a revelation or so-and-so witnessed this firsthand or whatever. And then when you start seeing, it's like people don't even want to acknowledge like it, like how texts have been altered over time and things like that. And then let alone, did somebody really, hear what they think they heard or whatever? And it's just people don't want to view that. Like, in other words, they're embracing. It's not just that they want to glean out of their religion whatever is good and take that with them. They want to use the religion as an excuse for not even embracing the world or viewing life in a way that's been much impacted by by modern science at all.
Yeah.
They still want to view the world as this kind of like magical place. And I guess they maybe compartmentalize it that I guess maybe for the heathen people, the heathen people have to rely on science. I say we, because those of us that don't believe that everything's happening as like some sort of direct act of God or whatever. But I guess for those who don't believe that everything's being caused by God, then I guess we have to rely on science. And but these other folks, it's like they'll rely on it, but yet they still want to think that there's some kind of like magic behind it or whatever. And that's what's kind of they don't really want to see things the way they are. And I'm not saying people should not believe in God or there's not a reason for believing in God, but here's the point. It's not that, I mean, really, we know why antibiotics work. Okay. We don't need some kind of a magical explanation about why God makes antibiotics work, for example. Now, most people, I think, won't really argue about that. But it's like people are like praying for God to guide the hands of the surgeon and all this stuff. Well, I mean, at a certain point, like if people really did believe that, then why would you even need somebody who was trained as a surgeon? Why not just send somebody else in there and ask God to guide their hands to do the right cutting and sewing and stuff that needed to be done?
Yeah. Well, I think that like the underlying problem here is that the question is like, what is truth?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And does something being true matter?
Yeah.
And we'll have to get into that in the next episode.
Yes.
But
yes. Yeah.
I think for a lot of people who adopt that like pre-scientific worldview, and I'm thinking of people like Answers in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
What's the guy's name?
Ken Ham.
Ken Ham.
Mm-hmm.
His whole argument is that like, well, evolution only makes sense if you make this assumption about like science and science being accurate. But if you don't make that assumption and you make this equivalent assumption that the Bible is accurate, then yada yada.
Yeah.
As if those are like
equivalents
on the same.
Yeah.
It's a major false equivalence that like, oh, well, these modernists just assume the Bible's wrong all the time.
Right.
As if like there's not evidence for things. And it's basically, if you really listen to him, his argument is that evidence doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
So that's the question. Like, does evidence matter? And why does evidence matter?
See, and this is why I think it's getting to a dangerous point. Let's put it this way. Whenever we're talking about a pretty new area of science where we're just starting to get data, it's just like, okay, so we learn more and more about something like autism, okay? Or we're learning more and more about, let's say ADHD.
Sure.
Okay, things like that. So like whenever they first started diagnosing this, it's like every kid with behavior problems was put on Ritalin. Well, okay, we know more about it now to know, okay, when's Ritalin a good idea? When's it not a good idea? And you start to kind of be able to sift this out. I can see when something is newer science, it's just like when they come out with a new, okay, so like a new technology. So like self-driving automobiles. Okay, so, well, yeah, they probably are going to operate really well in most conditions, but there may be certain conditions, and they find this, they're like crashing into things, and because it's just not, the technology is not good enough to handle all the contingencies that it's probably is going to have to face. And so this happens with any kind of learning curve. Well, I can understand that when we're on the brink of something new where people want to say, okay, yeah, gee, I'm going to kind of fall back here, and they kind of get to fall back on their faith a little and say, okay, let's put it this way. Let's say back whenever Darwin first came out with his theory, okay, I could see where somebody'd say, well, it's still pretty recent theory. I'll still give the benefit to the book of Genesis. But
sure,
my goodness, how much evidence does there have to be? And see, that ends up being the point. There is so much evidence now that Ken Ham is not just given the benefit of the doubt to the Bible. He's become anti-scientific.
Well, I do think that like what you described is like, well, I'll just give, there's not enough evidence, or this is a new theory that hasn't been like sufficiently proven. I'll just trust my religious belief.
Right.
I still think that is a pre-scientific.
Oh, it is.
Hangover,
it is.
Right? Because
I'm just saying it's the
scientific
lesser of two evils.
The scientific view, and maybe this is jumping the gun because we need to spend the next episode defining the scientific view.
Yeah.
But the scientific view allows you to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Which the religious view does not allow you to say that.
Well, yeah. And that is, yes, that is true. It's just that the world starts becoming, this is what I was saying. Before the theory of evolution was really developed, okay, and when it was in its early stages, then, okay, I still think to say, okay, you're still comparing something that comes from an ancient text, and you're going to somehow give that precedence over current empirical studies that are going on. Okay. Yes, there's something wrong with that, but I consider that a little more benign because there's not really a whole lot riding on evolution being true, but we're way past that point now. Like we study animals because we're so closely related to some of these animals. And there's a lot of evolutionary theory and behind our medical research today. And so we're at a point, and there's so much evidence. It's not just whether somebody wants to believe Genesis and they want to believe their religion literally. It really comes down to whether people are going to be guided by evidence or myth. And that is a much, much worse crime, intellectual crime, if I can call it that. That's the problem. That is the real problem. Now we're getting to, and I'll be honest with you, we're getting that point on other issues. We have people that want to determine what societal law is based on whatever their particular religion says about a social issue. Like
it's becoming political.
Well, yeah,
rather than ideological.
It's more than just people wanting the freedom to make their own choices. They're wanting to impose their religion. And why would we say they're imposing their religion? Because there is nothing empirical to back up their religion's view of what's being advanced. I got really irritated, okay, when I looked at the LinkedIn page of a young black man who is in Christian ministry, who's saying he wants to advance the biblical view of marriage. I want to say, hey, if you like the biblical view of marriage, how about we go back to the biblical view of race relations? Masters, be kind to your slaves. This is the kind of blind hypocrisy, see, that is really dangerous, because they want to benefit. They want to benefit from people saying, oh, well, we don't have to follow that literally. We know better than that now. But when it comes to somebody else, oh, no, we got to follow the text. People are so self-centered. They pick and choose anyway what parts they're going to follow and what parts they're not going to follow. There are a few flaky people out there that still just toss all of their reason out the window and just blindly follow their religion and don't think for themselves. And, you know, I feel sorry for you in a certain way. In other ways, I don't. But the people, most people, even the people that are causing the problems, they're just selectively, they don't even want to acknowledge that that's what they're doing. They just do it out of convenience. And then they'll convince themselves, just like I got offended by a woman who's in a position of power in a Christian denomination, who wants to take, again, the same position that because the text says so, well, then there's no room for argument. Well, ignoring like the part of the canonized scripture, whether Paul wrote it or not, it's still there. And the Catholics and the Baptists and other people still don't want to allow women into positions of authority. And they use those texts as an excuse. Again, if there was empirical evidence to say, yeah, women aren't really good under pressure and they don't make good decisions, or they're too emotional, or whatever. Like we used to make up all those things have all been debunked. And it's just like LGBTQ. Well, they're going to be recruiting our kids and they're pedophiles, or they're just, well, you read the book of Romans, people are homosexual just because they're sex addicts. Well, that's not the way it is. And we know that that's not the way it is. But that doesn't matter, because this stuff is all just a smokescreen for people to push their own values and use the name of God to do it. Because they'll follow the text whenever it's something that bothers them and they want that text to stand with them. But when it's something that they benefit from, well, I don't think God wants us to have to follow that today. It sickens me. I'm sorry.
I think, you brought up the ancient race relations. And I do think that is an interesting example of like where the pre-scientific worldview just like completely collapses.
Right.
Because the empirical evidence is so strong.
Right.
Empirical, for those playing along at home, empirical is just like directly observed.
Right.
Right. Like you can experience it yourself.
Right.
The observational evidence for the cruelty of slavery, so obvious, so clear, that we abandoned it and say you shouldn't have any slaves. You shouldn't own people at all.
Right.
Whereas, we pick on the Southern Baptist Convention for being pro-slavery in their founding.
Yeah.
But at least they're honest about what the Bible says about it, which is that. So I'll read, this is out of Leviticus chapter 25. God goes out of his way to say, as for the male and female slaves who you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may, now notice it's not like, he doesn't just say God, this is God speaking, right? God doesn't just say nothing about slavery. He says, no, you may do this. I specifically allow this. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you, and from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land. They may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property.
Wow.
These you may treat as slaves. But as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, let's be honest. Leviticus just says, like, you can have slaves, you can have property, you can pass them on to your children. They can live their entire lives as slaves, and you can treat them like property. But you can't do that to Israelites, because Israelites are special.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, why don't we round this one out, and then in our next episode we can talk about what is a scientific worldview and why does it matter? So let's we can get into it then.
All right. Well, if you have any thoughts about this episode, which I'm sure many in our audience do, let us know. You can reach us at thehappycynics@gmail.com, and we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on our YouTube channel, if anybody's watching there. If the world doesn't end, we will be back next week with part 2.